Hang in there, old-timer. Help's on the way. My son left me here. In the rain. Not anymore. The angels are here. All these men? For me?
An 82-year-old man sat trembling in the cold rain beside a forgotten bus stop on the edge of a quiet Montana highway, abandoned there only minutes earlier by his own son, his thin coat already soaked through and his hands shaking as water dripped from the brim of his old hat. And he had no way of knowing that in less than 10 minutes the silence around him would shatter with the thunder of engines as 150 bikers from the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club would roll in like a storm of chrome and leather to change the course of his worst day forever. The rain had come suddenly that afternoon in the small rural town of Redstone Valley, the kind of place where people still waved to each other at stop signs and where the main road only saw real traffic when trucks cut through on the way to somewhere bigger. And just an hour earlier, the sky had been clear and warm with that dull golden light that sometimes settles over late autumn afternoons before the weather decides to turn. Arthur Bennett had lived in Redstone Valley most of his life, long enough to watch the town shrink little by little as businesses closed and younger families moved away to cities where opportunity waited behind glass office towers instead of dusty hardware stores and fading grain elevators. And now, at 82 years old, he moved slowly through the world with the careful caution of someone whose body no longer obeyed the same commands it once had. His shoulders were narrow beneath his coat, his grey hair thin and wispy, and his hands carried the constant tremor of age. But the real change had started during the past year, when the small lapses began to appear. The kettle left boiling on the stove, the front door unlocked overnight, the slow, drifting forgetfulness that made his son Mark worry more every month. Mark Bennett had tried to be patient, at least in the beginning. He was 45 years old, worked long shifts at the lumberyard outside town, and had taken Arthur into his small house after the doctor quietly told him that living alone was becoming dangerous for someone Arthur's age. But patience has a way of thinning when life piles responsibilities faster than a person can carry them. And over time, the tension between father and son began to stretch tighter, like a rope pulled from both ends. That morning had started badly and ended worse. Arthur had forgotten to take his medication again and had left the back door open overnight, letting the cold wind sweep through the kitchen. And when Mark discovered it, the frustration that had been building for months finally spilled out in a burst of anger neither of them truly expected. "I can't keep doing this," Mark had said while pacing the narrow living room, his voice tight with exhaustion. Arthur sat quietly in the old armchair by the window trying to follow the conversation, even as it seemed to slip through the fog that had begun settling into his memory. "Doing what?" he asked gently. Mark ran his hands through his hair. "Taking care of everything. Watching you every second. I'm working double shifts, just to keep the lights on." Arthur lowered his eyes to the floor. "I never asked you to." The words were quiet, but they landed heavier than either of them intended. Mark stared at him for a long moment, and then something in his expression changed. The kind of tired resignation that comes when a person believes there are no good options left. "Get your coat," he said finally. Arthur looked up slowly. "Where are we going?" "Just get your coat." The drive out of town had been silent except for the low hum of tires on pavement and the distant rumble of thunder beginning somewhere beyond the hills. Arthur watched the familiar houses and shops pass by the window, tried to understand what was happening, but Mark kept his eyes locked on the road ahead and said nothing. When they reached the old bus stop 3 miles outside Redstone Valley, Mark pulled the truck onto the gravel shoulder and turned off the engine. The first drops of rain had just begun to tap against the windshield. Arthur frowned slightly. "Why are we stopping here?" Mark didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned across the seat and pushed open the passenger door. Cold air rushed inside. "You can wait here for a while," he said. Arthur blinked in confusion. "Wait for what?" Mark hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Someone will come along." Arthur looked at the empty stretch of highway. There were no houses nearby, no businesses, nothing but open land and a rusted bus sign that hadn't been used in years. The rain started falling harder now, drumming softly on the roof of a truck. "Son," Arthur said carefully, "it's starting to rain." Mark stared straight ahead, gripping the steering wheel. "Just sit under the shelter," he muttered. Arthur stepped slowly out of the truck, his joints stiff as he straightened himself beside the gravel shoulder. The cold rain touched his face immediately. He turned back toward the open window. "You're coming back?" "Right." Mark didn't answer. He simply closed the passenger door, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. Arthur stood there, watching the truck disappear down the road until the red tail lights faded into the grey curtain of rain. For a long moment, he didn't move at all, as if the world itself had paused around him. Then he slowly shuffled toward the small wooden bench beneath the rusted bus sign and sat down. The rain intensified quickly, pouring from the dark sky and heavy sheets that soaked through his coat within minutes. Water ran along the edge of the road in thin streams, and the wind carried the smell of wet earth across the empty fields. Arthur folded, his trembling hands together in his lap, and waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Cars occasionally rushed by on the highway, their tires spraying water across the pavement, but none of them slowed. None of them noticed the thin old man sitting quietly in the rain beside a forgotten bus stop. Arthur didn't cry. He simply sat there, his shoulders slightly hunched, staring down the road in the direction his son had gone. Maybe Mark would come back, he thought. Maybe he had only needed time to calm down. Maybe this was all some terrible misunderstanding that would soon correct itself. The rain kept falling. 15 minutes passed, then 20. The cold began creeping deeper into his bones, and his hands shook more noticeably now as he tried to pull his coat tighter around his frail body. And then suddenly, through the steady drumming of rain, Arthur felt something strange beneath the bench, a low vibration humming through the ground like distant thunder. At first, he thought it might be a storm rolling in across the hills, but the sound grew louder, stronger, closer. The vibration turned into a deep, roaring rumble that echoed along the highway, and Arthur slowly lifted his head toward the bend in the road, just as the first bright headlight appeared through the ring. Then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire curve of highway lit up with a river of approaching motorcycles, engines thundering together in a powerful chorus that filled the grey afternoon air. And Arthur Bennett, soaked, abandoned, and alone, only moments before, washed in stunned silence as what looked like an army of bikers began slowing down and pulling onto the shoulder beside him. The old man sitting alone in the rain had no idea that the thunder rolling toward him wasn't a storm at all, but the sound of more than 100 motorcycles slowing down on the wet highway, their engines rumbling like distant tea. Hundreds one by one, the riders began pulling onto the gravel shoulder beside the forgotten bus stop. And within seconds, Arthur Bennett found himself staring at a sight so unexpected that for a moment he wondered if his tired mind was playing tricks on him. Headlights cut through the grey rain like rows of glowing eyes, chrome gleamed beneath the dark sky, and the roar of engines slowly faded into a heavy silence as bikes came to a stop along the roadside in a long line that stretched farther than Arthur could see without turning his head. Leather-clad riders swung their legs off their motorcycles, boots crunching against wet gravel as they stepped down and looked toward the small bus shelter where the frail old man sat shivering on the bench. There were dozens of them at first glance, maybe more broad-shouldered men with thick beards, tattoos winding down their arms, and black leather vests covered in patches that Arthur couldn't quite read through the ring. They looked, by every outward measure, like the exact kind of men a quiet old grandfather might feel nervous about meeting alone on a deserted highway, but the first man who approached him did not walk with menace or impatience. He walked slowly and carefully, like someone approaching a frightened animal that might bolt if startled. He was enormous, easily 6'4", with a wide chest and a grey beard that spread across his vest like a winter cloud. And when he stopped in front of Arthur, he lowered himself into a crouch, so their eyes were level, rain running off the edge of his leather jacket, as if he didn't even notice it. For a few seconds, He simply studied the old man sitting there soaked and trembling beneath the broken shelter. His expression wasn't hard, it wasn't angry. If anything, it looked deeply concerned. "Afternoon, sir?" he said finally, his voice low and rough from years of wind and open road. "You doing a right out here?" Arthur hesitated before answering. His mind was still catching up with the strange moment unfolding around him. He looked past the man and saw row after row of motorcycles, riders standing nearby, watching quietly, the rain dripping from their helmets and beards. Then he looked back at the man crouched in front of him. "I suppose I'm not," Arthur admitted softly. The big man nodded slowly as if that answer confirmed exactly what he had suspected. "Name's Frank," he said, offering a large hand that Arthur hesitantly shook. "Frank Donovan." Arthur's thin fingers disappeared inside the biker's grip. "Arthur Bennett," he replied. Frank glanced around the empty roadside before asking the question that had already formed in his mind the moment he saw the old man sitting there. "You waiting for someone, Arthur?" Arthur looked down at the wet gravel near his shoes. For a moment he didn't answer. Then he spoke quietly, almost apologetically. "My son brought me here." A few of the riders, standing close enough to hear, exchanged brief looks. Frank remained still. "He bring you here to catch a bus?" Frank asked. Arthur slowly shook his head. "There hasn't been a bus here in years." That single sentence hung in the damp air for a moment, heavy with meaning that didn't need further explanation. Frank's eyes hardened slightly, not toward Arthur, but toward the road stretching back toward town. Behind him, several bikers shifted their weight uneasily, the silent understanding spreading through the group almost instantly. Frank stood and turned toward the man gathered near the bikes. "Hey, Tank," he called. A tall rider with a shaved head stepped forward. "Yeah, grab one of the blankets out of your saddleback." Another rider, a younger man with a dark beard, was already digging through his gear before Frank even finished speaking. Within seconds, a thick wool blanket appeared, followed by a large rain poncho that someone unfolded and gently draped around Arthur's shoulders. The sudden warmth startled him more than the cold had. "Oh, you don't have to," Arthur began. "Sure we do," Tank interrupted kindly as he tucked the blanket around the old man's legs. Another biker approached, holding a metal thermos. "Coffee," he offered. Arthur looked up at him with tired eyes. "I'd appreciate that." The man poured a steaming cup and carefully placed it in Arthur's trembling hands. The warmth spread through his fingers immediately, and for the first time since the rain began, he felt a small piece of the cold start to fade. Meanwhile, Frank turned slightly away and spoke quietly to one of the riders standing nearby. "Louise," he said, "call the sheriff's department. Let them know what we've got going on here." Louise nodded and stepped aside, pulling out his phone. Within minutes, the strange scene on the highway had transformed completely. What had been an abandoned bus stop was now surrounded by a protective circle of bikers, some standing in the rain, others leaning against their motorcycles, all keeping a quiet eye on the frail man sitting beneath the shelter. One rider unfolded a small folding chair from his gear and replaced the wet bench so Arthur wouldn't have to sit in the cold. Another handed him a granola bar from a saddlebag. Arthur looked around in amazement. "There must be 100 of you," he said quietly. Frank chuckled. "Closer to 150 today. We were heading to a charity ride in Billings." Arthur blinked in disbelief. "You all stopped just for me." Frank shrugged like it was the most ordinary decision in the world. Seemed like the right thing to do. Arthur studied the men around him more closely now. They didn't look dangerous anymore. They looked concerned, patient, protective. One of them even stood holding a small umbrella over the old man so the rain wouldn't keep falling on him while he drank his coffee. Arthur swallowed slowly. "I'm sorry to trouble all of you," he said. Frank shook his head firmly. "You didn't trouble us, Arthur. Your son leaving you here did." The words were spoken calmly, but they carried a quiet strength that made several of the riders nod in agreement. For a moment, Arthur didn't know what to say. The rain continued falling steadily around them, tapping against leather jackets and chrome fenders. But the old man sitting beneath the shelter no longer looked quite so small or alone. Because, in the span of only a few minutes, one abandoned grandfather had somehow become the center of attention for 150 road-hardened bikers who had decided, without hesitation or discussion, that they weren't going anywhere until they knew he was safe. And as Arthur Bennett slowly sipped his hot coffee beneath the gray Montana sky, the distant sound of a sheriff's siren finally began echoing down the wet highway toward them. The frail old man who had been abandoned in the rain less than an hour earlier now sat wrapped in a thick blanket beneath the small bus shelter, surrounded by more than 100 bikers who had quietly decided they were not leaving his side. And as the distant wail of a sheriff's siren began to echo down the wet Montana highway, Arthur Bennett looked out at the long row of motorcycles and leather-clad riders standing patiently in the rain and felt something he had not felt since his son's truck disappeared around the bend. He felt safe. The siren grew louder until a sheriff's cruiser finally appeared through the gray curtain of rain, its flashing lights reflecting off chrome fenders and wet pavement as it slowed and pulled onto the gravel shoulder. Deputy Caleb Turner stepped out of the vehicle and paused for a moment, taking in the unusual scene before him. One elderly man wrapped in blankets under a rusted bus shelter and an entire convoy of bikers standing nearby like a silent protective wall. Turner had been with the county sheriff's department for nearly 12 years and thought he had seen just about everything rural Montana could throw at him. But this particular sight clearly wasn't part of the usual afternoon routine. He adjusted his hat against the rain and approached slowly. Frank Donovan stepped forward to meet him halfway. The two men shook hands briefly. "Afternoon, Deputy?" Frank said calmly. Turner glanced past him toward Arthur. "Mind telling me what's going on here?" Frank nodded toward the shelter. "Old gentleman's name is Arthur Bennett, says. His son dropped him here about half an hour ago and drove off." The deputy's eyebrows pulled together slightly as he looked at the frail figure on the chair. "Life him here. That's what he told us," Frank replied. Turner let out a quiet breath before walking over and kneeling beside Arthur so they could speak face to face. "Sir, I'm Deputy Turner. Can you tell me what happened today?" Arthur explained slowly, his voice soft but steady as he described the argument with his son, the drive out of town, and the moment Mark had opened the door and told him to wait by the bus stop. Turner listened carefully, occasionally glancing toward the riders standing nearby, who remained respectfully silent during the conversation. When Arthur finished speaking, the deputy nodded thoughtfully. "All right, Mr. Bennett. We're going to make sure you're taken somewhere warm and safe tonight." Arthur looked down at his hands. "I don't want to cause any trouble for my boy," he said quietly. Turner chose his next words carefully. "Right now, our priority is making sure you're okay." While the deputy stepped aside to radio in the situation, Frank walked back toward Arthur. The rain had softened into a steady drizzle now, and the sky was slowly turning darker as evening approached. "Sounds like they'll get you somewhere comfortable tonight," Frank said. Arthur nodded, but looked uneasy. "I don't really have anywhere else to go." Frank glanced toward the long row of motorcycles. A few of the riders were leaning against their bikes, talking quietly. Others simply standing watch with arms folded across their chests. None of them looked impatient about the delay. Frank turned back to Arthur. "You do now," he said simply. Arthur blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" Before Frank could answer, Deputy Turner returned. "I've contacted county services," he explained. "They're arranging temporary housing for Mr. Bennett until we can sort things out with family." Frank nodded approvingly. "Good." The deputy studied the group again. "I'll be honest," Turner admitted when dispatch said there were 100 bikers surrounding an elderly man on the highway. "I expected a different kind of situation." A few of the riders chuckled quietly. Frank gave a small smile. "Sometimes things aren't what they look like." Another rider named Louis stepped forward, holding a small paper bag. "We grabbed some food from the gas station down the road while you were talking," he said, handing it to Arthur. Inside were sandwiches, fruit, and a bottle of water. Arthur stared at the bag like it might disappear if he blinked. "You boys didn't have to do all this," he murmured. Frank shook his head gently. "Maybe not, but we wanted to. The drizzle continued falling while the strange roadside gathering lingered for another 20 minutes until a county social services vehicle arrived. A middle-aged woman named Carol stepped out and approached the group with professional calm, though her eyes widened slightly when she realized just how many bikers were present. Deputy Turner quickly explained the situation. Carol then knelt beside Arthur and spoke to him in a warm, reassuring tone about this temporary housing they had arranged nearby. Arthur listened quietly before nodding. When it was time for him to stand, two riders stepped forward instinctively to help him rise from the chair, moving carefully so he wouldn't lose his balance on the wet gravel. As Carol led him toward the county vehicle, Arthur suddenly turned back toward the group of bikers. More than 100 of them stood along the roadside watching. Some had their arms crossed, others held helmets under their arms. None of them spoke. For a moment, Arthur simply looked at them, trying to find the right words. "I didn't expect any of this today," he said softly. Frank stepped forward slightly. "Sometimes the road surprises you." Arthur nodded slowly. Then he did something that made several of the riders glance away awkwardly. The old man reached out and hugged Frank. It was a small, fragile hug compared to the biker's massive frame, but Frank returned it gently, resting one large hand on Arthur's back. When they stepped apart, Arthur's eyes were bright with emotion. "Thank you," he said. "All of you." One of the riders started clapping softly, and a few others joined in, the sound echoing quietly along the empty highway. Arthur climbed into the county vehicle and watched through the window as the long line of bikers stood beside their motorcycles under the fading gray sky. Several of them lifted their hands and waved as the car pulled away. Arthur raised his hand and waved back until the motorcycles became small shapes in the distance. The road fell quiet again once the vehicles disappeared, leaving only the fading drizzle and the rumble of engines, as the bikers finally began starting their bikes one by one. Frank Donovan climbed onto his motorcycle and looked once more down the road where the old man had gone. "All right, boys," he said over the rumble of engines. "Let's ride." The convoy slowly rolled back onto the highway, their headlights cutting through the evening mist as they disappeared down the long Montana road. But long after the sound of those engines faded, Arthur Bennett would remember the moment he realized that on the worst day of his life, when he believed he had been completely abandoned, 150 strangers on motorcycles had stopped in the rain and refused to leave until they knew he was safe.